A little bit late today. I'm glad to see you all. We have important work that we do, and it's always good to know that there are people who are here to hear about that work. This is the Robert Harris Memorial Lecture, and the lecture is named in the honor of the community member who was instrumental in working with people at Sonoma State to start the lecture series. And that work is also sponsored by a group that he was involved with called the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust at Sonoma State University. And they are the people who do some really wonderful things that allow us to have visitors like Jerry Fowler come. I'd like to introduce the president of the Alliance, who is also one of the faculty members on the lecture series, Barbara Lash McCaffrey, who has a few words that she'd like to share with you.
I keep on threatening to bring in my WD-40, but I keep on forgetting it. Sorry about that. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you on behalf of the Alliance today for the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. Not only did Robert L. Harris have an instrumental role in starting the lecture series, but he actually approached the university and asked the university to do something to remember the Holocaust. Initially, it was a commemoration of the Holocaust, which usually occurs in early May, called Yom HaShoah, and that is a collaboration between the Alliance and the Jewish Community Agency, and that event we'll be talking about later on. It will take place on the campus in the Cooperage on May 1st, I believe from 1 to 3 o'clock, and we'll be giving students more information about that. I wanted to just say a bit about the Alliance because it is a unique university-community collaboration. And one of the things that group did this year was finally have a reflection on where we are 20 or more years on. And I wanted to share with you just a little bit about this. The group was formed in 1982 on behalf of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and the need to tell the stories and learn their experiences. Those who began the collaborative effort between the community and members of the university faculty promised to let the world know of the atrocities that occur. The initial intention, or at least one of the most important ones, was to learn the facts, act on them, and never forget. The name chosen was the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and as one of the founding members said, the acronym ASH says it all. As a result of this series and these efforts, the series was created as well as the Yom HaShoah commemoration. This university community partnership is what funds all of the expenses for our guest lecturers. The university pays for the faculty and the course. So it really is unique among classes at the university. The current mission is to support the lecture series and provide programming to the larger community, including teachers in our kindergarten through 12th grade schools, and to collaborate with other community groups working on issues related to the Holocaust and genocide. I'm hoping that many of you are here today, not only to hear Jerry Fowler's talk, but to interact with those of us who are part of the Alliance. If you haven't already joined our mailing list, there is information as you leave. There's a sign-up sheet. There are flyers with information about the lecture series in the Alliance. And I hope you will come and chat with me afterward, and I look forward to meeting many of you. I'm also very heartened to see a whole another SSU class here. I believe Elizabeth Heron's creative writing class is with us. Is that correct? Great. Welcome. Would you raise your hand so we know who you are? Thank you. And people from the local community who are joining us either because you're on the board of the Alliance, you're part of the Alliance, or you're interested in learning about the Holocaust and genocide, can we welcome you as well with a show of hands? Thank you so much. I'm going to turn the mic over to Myrna Goodman, who is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, and also the coordinator of the lecture series.
I'd like everybody to give the regular students a hand. Thanks, Barbara. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jerry Fowler to you. This is the third time that Jerry has come to the lecture series to speak. The first time he came was in 2002, and he brought with him some new brochures at the time, which were titled Genocide Warning, and I'm sure you can see it. It says Sudan. That was 3 years ago now, and we're still contemplating what's going on in the Sudan. I'd like to tell you a bit about Jerry. He's an attorney who teaches refugee and asylum law as an adjunct faculty member at George Washington University Law School. He's also worked as a legislative counsel for the Lawyers Committee on Human Rights. He testified before Congress on the situation in the Sudan, and in May 2004, Jerry visited Sudanese refugee camps in Chad and collected personal stories from survivors. He's an impassioned spokesman for the cause of human rights, dedicated to transforming the promise of never again into the reality of not this time. If you do research on the internet and you put Jerry's name in, you get a rock musician, but if you put Jerry Fowler and you put the word Sudan in, you run across between, I estimated, 30 and 50 different citations to places that Jerry has been to talk about what is going on in the Sudan. He is a tireless spokesperson for the committee and for the world to raise our attention to what is going on right in our midst. We do live in a very small world. So I hope this is not the last time he will be here to speak on behalf of the Committee on Conscience. But I hope the next time perhaps it might be a report about how the genocide had been prevented. I would like you to join me in welcoming Jerry Fowler.
Thank you, Myrna. That was very kind. I'm glad to know that if you put in Jerry Fowler in Sudan, you get a lot of relevant hits. I found occasionally, I've looked on the internet for Jerry Fowler, and what usually pops up is the fact that there was a state elections commissioner in Louisiana who was named Jerry Fowler and who went to prison for bribery. And I spoke in Louisiana a couple of years ago, and every time I'd say my name, people would start laughing. And so I'm glad I'm, at least in this audience, not confused with that Jerry Fowler. It's really a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to come back to Sonoma State again. It's something that I've looked forward to every time I've had the opportunity to come. The previous couple of times that I came, I primarily addressed the idea of the relationship between memory, remembering the past, and conscience, how we interpret the present, the world in which we live. And usually I've gone on that topic for about 45 minutes. Today I'm going to talk about that for about 3 minutes and then get on to the situation in Darfur. But I did want to preface what I have to say with some remarks about the connection between remembering the past and especially remembering the Holocaust and viewing the world that we live in today. Because we at the Holocaust Museum believe there's a very tight connection. And I think the way that I want to illustrate it is by talking about a man named Raphael Lemkin. How many people in this audience know who Raphael Lemkin is? Well, this is a very well-educated audience. You know, I ask this question all over the country. with other very well-educated audiences, and usually if I get one or two, I'm very lucky. So all of you know that Raphael Lemkin was a Jewish refugee from Poland who fled Poland in 1939 and ended up in the United States, where he was trying to make people understand what was happening in Nazi-occupied Europe. And he felt that if he could give a name to what the Nazis were doing, that then people would get it, that they would understand. And so he coined the word genocide by combining the Greek word for tribe or nation with the Latin word for killing. And unfortunately, his hope that that would help spark a reaction that would save lives during the Holocaust was not realized. In fact, he didn't publish this word until very late in the war, in November of 1944, and by the time that he published it, most of the people who perished in the Holocaust were already dead. But he didn't stop there, as you know. He went on because he had this vision that if genocide could be recognized in international law, that then countries would prevent it in the future, or if it occurred, they would act to stop it. And he was instrumental in the adoption of the United Nations Genocide Convention, which was adopted in 1948. But the reason I dwell on Lemkin is because of the connection that he saw between remembering and honoring the family that he lost in the Holocaust and trying to shape the world in which he lived. When the Genocide Convention was passed, journalists went looking for him because he had been so instrumental in its passage, and they couldn't find him. And finally, they found him in a darkened hallway, and he was crying and just said, "Go away, I can't talk right now." And he commented later that he saw the Genocide Convention, this attempt to create a world where people are not destroyed because of their group identity, as the epitaph on his mother's grave. And he also said that he felt that the purpose of human memory is not just to record past events, but to stimulate conscience, that our remembrance of the past shapes the moral context in which we see the present. That idea has been embodied in the work of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And let me ask this question: how many people here have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington? Not so many as know about Lemkin. It's usually the opposite when I talk. But I encourage those of you who make it to Washington to come to the Holocaust Museum. Our primary mission there, obviously, is as a Holocaust memorial, of documenting and preserving the memory of an event that happened 60 years ago. But we also have an obligation to speak in the present. And I'm privileged to be the staff director of the museum's Committee on Conscience, which is a committee of the museum's governing board, which guides the genocide prevention activities of the museum. And that vision is based on or that mission rather, is based on the vision of Elie Wiesel and other members of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, which first recommended the creation of a memorial museum way back in the 1970s. When they recommended to President Jimmy Carter that the nation should build a Holocaust memorial, they also said that it should address contemporary threats of genocide. And the phrase that they used is that a memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. It would violate the memory that we're trying to preserve if we did not also speak out in the present. And so that's what underlies the mission of the Committee on Conscience. Most recently, as Myrna suggested, we've been addressing the situation in the Darfur region of Sudan. And that's what I want to talk about today. As Myrna mentioned, I traveled to the neighboring country of Chad last May, where I interviewed a large number of Sudanese refugees who had fled from Darfur. And what I want to share with you today is images from that trip, the stories that I heard, and then also have some images that are much more recent from inside Darfur that only recently came to light because of the work of a young American who has been in Darfur with a small African Union monitoring force that is on the ground. This talk, and actually, is it possible to turn off the lights so you can see the pictures a little bit better? I hope that won't ruin your webcast. This talk is titled, "Who Will Survive Today?" And that's also the title of a special exhibition that we have in the museum that addresses Darfur. And there are two things that I want to emphasize about that title. The first is the word today. As you can imagine, most people who come to our museum come expecting to learn something about history, specifically about an event that happened 60 years ago. And they do learn a lot of history. But we also wanted to underscore that the issues raised by the Holocaust are not just historical issues, and that the events that are happening in Darfur are happening even as we speak, and lives are hanging in the balance even as we speak. The second aspect of this title that I want to emphasize is the fact that it's a question. It's a question. When we teach about the Holocaust, or when we teach teachers to teach about the Holocaust, one of the guidelines that we emphasize is that just because something was inevitable, just because something happened doesn't mean it was inevitable. What happened 60 years ago and more with regard to the Holocaust was the product of a large number of choices and decisions that people made. Choices and decisions by perpetrators, but also choices and decisions by bystanders, including bystander nations, such as the United States. And what happened was not inevitable. It was the product of those choices and decisions. The same thing is true today. What will happen in Darfur is not inevitable, even though right now the trends look very negative. But what will happen will depend upon decisions and choices that are still to be made. Certainly decisions that are being made on the ground in Darfur and in the Sudanese capital of Sudan, but also decisions that are being made elsewhere in the world, including in Washington, D.C. And those decisions, in turn, are influenced by decisions that we make as citizens, whether we choose to speak out or remain silent, because ultimately our government, in its decision-making, in its creation of priorities, responds to what it thinks the American public cares about. So in a very real sense, what happens and who survives in Darfur will be a product of choices that are made by all of us in this room today. Just to briefly orient you on where Sudan is, it is in Northeast Africa. It's Africa's largest country. To give you a sense of its scale, it is about the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. Darfur itself is quite large. Actually, I usually say, because this is what usually is, about the size of France or the size of Texas. People sometimes often say it's a little bit larger than California. So that may give you a better sense of how big it is. The situation there is very complex. And I always try to give some sense of the underlying causes of the conflict without getting too mired in the complexity. Because as important as it is to respect the complexity, we also have to keep track of the moral contours of the situation. The moral contours are this, that in the last 2 years, about 2 million people have been driven from their homes through violence. Their villages have been destroyed, their property has been stolen. An estimated 300,000 people have perished, many of them murdered in direct violence. Others have died because of the conditions of life that have been inflicted on them. Lack of adequate food, lack of adequate water, lack of adequate medical care after they've been driven from their homes by the government of Sudan and militias that are allied with it. Thousands of women and girls have been raped, and this violence is continuing today. Those are the broad moral contours of the situation. Because of the severity of the situation, because the violence is directed at specific identifiable ethnic groups, last July, the Holocaust Museum, for the first time in its history, declared a genocide emergency. We declared a genocide emergency for Darfur. That's how serious the situation is. As I said, the background is exceedingly complex, but to give you a thumbnail sketch, in early 2003, just over 2 years ago, a rebellion began in the Darfur region. And I should say that the population of Darfur, at least at the beginning of 2003, was in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 million people, divided among a lot of different ethnic groups. It's very diverse. Unfortunately, over the last 10 or 20 years, the distinctions among the ethnic groups have tended to divide along a line on one side of which are people who identify themselves as Arabs, and on the other side of which are people who identify themselves as African. Now, this idea of African is a little bit of a misnomer because everyone who lives in Sudan is an African, literally. They all live in Africa. Over time, if you step back and look at the last century or over centuries, the lines between these different groups are not very clear. People intermarry. People may change their lifestyle, so they might be born into one group and end up with another group. But for a variety of reasons, including actions by the Sudanese government, over the last 10 to 20 years, the identities have become much more rigidified, and this line between Arabs and so-called Africans has become more distinct. Well, when this rebellion began in early 2003, the rebels drew their recruits from the so-called African groups. And these African groups have names that you may have read in the paper. The Zagawa is one of the big groups. The Four, for which Darfur gets its name. Darfur means in Arabic land of the four. And they're one of the major ethnic groups there. And a third major group is called the Masalit. Well, the response of the government of Sudan to this rebellion was basically this. If the rebels draw their recruits from these African groups, if the African groups don't exist, then the rebels won't exist. And so they basically launched a war against the civilian populations of the so-called African groups. And it's those people who are overwhelmingly the victims of the violence. And I should just say that the nature of the violence, the responsibility of the government and of militias that it recruited among the Arab population of Darfur is very well established. It's been established by the United Nations. It's been established by the United States government. It's been established by independent human rights groups. It's been established by independent journalists. Everyone with any detachment who has looked at the situation has basically come to the same conclusion in terms of the responsibility of the Sudanese government and its allies for what is happening there. As I mentioned, I traveled to Chad, which you can see just to the west of Sudan. Of the 2 million people who have been driven from their homes, about 200,000 have crossed over into Chad and are living as refugees. The vast majority are still inside Darfur, living often in what are sometimes referred to as camps for internally displaced people. Many of the places where they're living are not really camps in the sense that they're not organized. They've moved to larger towns and cities when their villages have been destroyed, and they're living in big agglomerations of people that are quite chaotic and where the conditions are very severe. When I was in Chad, I traveled up and down the border, basically the squiggly part of the border between Chad and Sudan. And so most of the images that I'm going to show you now are ones that I took there in Chad. The first thing I want to do is just give you a sense of what the terrain looks like. This, of course, is the desert in Chad. The desert extends into Darfur. There are a few portions of Darfur that are a little bit more lush than this. And as you move further south, there's more vegetation. But by and large, it's a pretty harsh desert terrain. So this is the kind of environment that people were driven into when their villages were destroyed. The people that I talked to, many of them had walked 2 or 3 weeks through this desert in order to get to Chad. By and large, the people who fled to Chad were the ones who lived closest to the border. And the people who didn't get to Chad were ones who were too far away to make it. Many of the refugees in Chad have been settled in camps. And in Chad, they are camps. They're pretty well organized. They're organized under the auspices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and they are administered by international aid organizations. Now, the idea ultimately is to provide tents to everyone who makes it to these camps. But at least at the time I was there, and I think it's still the case, there are not enough tents to go around. So what they do is issue sheeting to a plastic sheeting to the refugees, and then they use that sheeting along with sticks and maybe some cloth that they brought with them to create a makeshift structure. You might have a family of 5 or so living in a structure of that size. The environment, as I said, is harsh. During the time I was there, the daily temperature would get up to about 115 degrees. A daily occurrence also during the time I was there was a sandstorm. And you can see in the back of this picture it's starting to get a little hazy because the wind is starting to kick up. Later on I'll show you a full-blown sandstorm. But you can imagine what it would be like to live in a hut like this with sand blowing all around. After I was there, starting in early July and lasting through September, was the rainy season, where the rains move up from the south. And what the rainy season means is that just about every day there would be a torrential downpour for as long as an hour or 2 hours. And again, you can imagine what it's like to live in a hut like this with a torrential downpour. Some of the people that I met were not yet in camps. They were literally living under trees, as was this woman. She had just crossed over the border about 2 days before I met her. She came with a group of 60 other refugees who had fled when their village was attacked and destroyed. You can see scattered around her the things that she brought with her, the things that she was able to save from the village. A few blankets, some pots, some jugs. What might be more difficult to see is that she has 2 bullet wounds in her right leg, one right below the knee and the other on the bottom of her right foot. She was shot when she and a 17-year-old girl went to a well to get water for themselves and the other refugees that they were fleeing with. And there was a Sudanese soldier guarding the well. Now think about that for a minute. These people have been driven into a desert where they can't survive without water, but the Sudanese government is guarding the wells. Well, when they approached this well, the Sudanese soldier in this case grabbed the 17-year-old girl, and the woman tried to pull the girl back, and that's when the soldier shot her. He took the girl away to a nearby army encampment, and she was found 2 days later, still alive, but covered in blood, and both of her legs were broken. This is one anecdote, but the use of sexual violence against women and girls has been extensively documented. Many, many women have reported being gang raped. And what's worse is that this violence has been accompanied by racial epithets. This division between African and Arab is seen subjectively as a racial division. There's not an objective racial difference, but there's a subjective racial difference. So it's been reported, for example, that women, as they were being raped, were being taunted, saying by their attackers, who would say things like, "We're going to make a light-skinned baby. When we're finished, there won't be any black skins around here." These are other people who were living under trees near the border. This was about 200 yards from the border, so it was very close. There were something in the neighborhood of 10,000 people living right in outside of a small town there in Chad. The UN has since created another camp nearby where these people have been able to be sheltered and accommodated. I met a number of people who had been attacked by Sudanese aircraft. This man lost his leg, actually, after he and a group of refugees were attacked. It's another very common practice by the Sudanese government. They use helicopters or bombers to attack civilians. One reason this is particularly significant is that the Sudanese government often says, well, we're not responsible for this violence. This is tribal violence. This is conflict between groups. And these militias, which are sometimes called Janjaweed, those guys are outlaws. We don't have anything to do with them. But the fact is that the Janjaweed militias don't have airplanes. The Sudanese government has airplanes, and it uses the airplanes to attack civilians, including as recently as the last couple of months. They now have said that they're pulling their aircraft out of Darfur and will stop using them. But one practice that the Sudanese government has and had for many, many years in a similar conflict in the south is to, when pressure starts to build, to give some concessions, and then when the pressure lets up, they go back to doing what they were doing all along. Here's some people, women who are waiting probably for food distribution. These women here probably just arrived They've just been issued their sheeting and some water jugs. Some more of the women. This was a list that the refugees in one of the camps compiled of massacres that they had witnessed. You can see that they actually wrote the list in a kind of rough English because they wanted to share it with people like me and with journalists who were coming through the camps. Almost every refugee that I talked to was very eager to tell me his or her story. They were desperate to get their stories heard and to get the word out about what was happening to them. They were very grateful to think that somebody would bring their stories back. It reminded me of something that I've learned from many of the Holocaust survivors that I know, how many of them felt abandoned during the Holocaust. It's a feeling of bitterness that they still carry with them 60 years later, the sense that nobody cared, that they had been abandoned. And these people in Chad, and I'm sure it's true of the people in Darfur, desperately want not to feel abandoned. One of the most touching moments while I was in the camps actually occurred around when I took the first picture I started with. It was a group, an older gentleman and some women and children. And I listened to their stories, and I thanked them for telling me their stories. And as I finished, he made the gesture that I caught with my camera, where he folded his hands and he ducked his head. And he said, well, now this grandfather can be happy because I know somebody's taking our story back. And so I felt a tremendous responsibility to come back and share these stories with as many people as I could. These people desperately want not to be abandoned. One thing you can see about this list, the column on the right there is kind of kill, by which they mean the kind of attack in this particular village. And first they have the letters GA, by which they mean Janjaweed, this Arab militia that the government organized and coordinates. And then the second word is a phonetic spelling of Antonov, which is the name of one of the Sudanese airplanes that they use to bomb civilians. They're actually converted cargo planes where they'll fly over a village and they lower the ramp at the back and they roll out barrel bombs, which are basically big 50-gallon drums that are filled with explosives and nails and shrapnel. It's not very good in a military sense, but it's very effective at sowing terror and hurting people. This was a woman who fled her village when it was attacked, and she told me that her husband had been kidnapped by the Janjaweed. And I found that to be very poignant, the fact that she said he had been kidnapped, because there actually aren't any reports of the Janjaweed taking prisoners. They do sometimes take people, usually men and boys, away from a village, but they only take them a short distance and then they execute them. There have been a number of documented instances of that happening. But in this woman's mind, her husband had been kidnapped. So it could be that he is a prisoner someplace, and she was holding on to that hope, no matter how unlikely or slim it might be. This woman also fled when her village was attacked. And the day I met her, we were sitting in one of those little huts, and outside it was about 115 degrees, and inside it was very oppressive. It was very hot. I was sitting there with her and her 4 children and an older neighbor and my translator. And she told me about the day that her village was attacked. And on that day, her father was killed, and her brother was killed, and her cousin was killed, and 30 people in her village were killed, and her mother disappeared. And by the time that I met her, I'd been in the camps for a number of days, and I'd been hearing these stories over and over. And with the heat and the accumulation of the stories, I remember having a very strong desire just to get out of that hut. And so I thanked her and started to back out of the hut, and then she started speaking in a very low voice. And I looked over at her, and her tears were splashing down onto her cheeks. And she was saying, "What about my mother? What about my mother? I don't know where she is. I don't know if she's alive or if she's dead." And I felt like she was asking me for an answer, which I couldn't possibly give. And all I could think to say was, tell me your mother's name, and I will take her name back and tell other people, and you will at least know that other people are thinking about your mother. And her mother's name is Hadiya Ahmed. Hadiya Ahmed, which is actually a very common name in Darfur. But for me, as vast as this catastrophe is, and as difficult to comprehend as it is to think about 2 million people driven from their homes and 300,000 dead and all the suffering, it also comes down to one woman who doesn't know where her mother is and won't know where her mother is until there's peace and security in Darfur. There are many, many children in these camps. A disproportionate number of children, disproportionate number of women and children, relatively few men, because they're often the victims of direct violence. But the presence of the children and to see them particularly touched me because I'm the father of 2 young daughters. Many of the children that I saw were living in the moment, the way that kids do whenever they get the chance. They would laugh and they would smile. This girl saw me, I was actually taking a picture of the donkey, and she came over and wanted to be in the picture. But I also saw children who were not in very good shape, children who were obviously bearing burdens, children who were malnourished. These kids actually were lucky in the sense that they had been identified as malnourished by Doctors Without Borders, who were operating a feeding center. Although in one of the camps that I visited, in the 11 days before I got there were 7 children who died because of malnutrition. So in spite of Doctors Without Borders being there, they weren't able to reach everyone. There were also children that I saw who obviously appeared to be traumatized. And one of the questions that I kept asking myself was, what kind of future do these children have? And for the kids who are still inside Darfur, do they even have a future? And I traveled all around the country last fall speaking about this to audiences like this and asking those questions. And unfortunately, a partial answer to the question was given very recently in the New York Times. A young man named Brian Steidel, who was an American serving with the African Union Monitoring Force. There's a very small African Union force that is on the ground in Darfur that's supposed to be monitoring a ceasefire. And as Brian says, their kind of black joke was that they spent all their time searching for the ceasefire because it didn't really exist. And in fact, what they were doing was documenting that villages were still being attacked. This is one where this hut had just been set on fire by Janjaweed militia. There's an entire village that's going up in smoke. But children are being attacked. This was the first picture Brian took in Sudan. And it was a little girl who was being carried on her mother's back as they fled when the village was attacked. And she was shot through the back. This is another little boy, January of this year, who was killed along with 100 other people when the village was attacked. So unfortunately, the answer to the question of whether the children in Darfur have a future is that many of them don't. They're still dying. They're still being killed. These are other pictures that were published in the New York Times on the op-ed page. It is a crisis that is continuing, that is getting worse. It's not getting better. This is a picture, and the next one, of dust storms, sandstorms. And to me, it symbolizes the situation that the Darfurians find themselves in. They are caught in a storm. It's very difficult to see what lies ahead. This picture was taken at high noon, and you could barely see 100 yards. But it brings me back to the question that I started with, or the point that I started with, which is what is going to happen in the future depends upon decisions that are still being made. And whether people will survive and who will survive turns on things that we do and that other people do around the world. I hope that you're asking, well, what can I do? Because you, especially students here, but everyone who's a member of a community has the opportunity to make a difference in what is happening in Darfur. And the only way that we can make a difference is if we work together and raise our voices. There are 5 things that I suggest. The first is to keep informed about this. There's information out there. There's more to learn. It's a complex situation, true, but it doesn't mean that we can't understand it and that we can't learn more about it. And one good basis for action is increasing your knowledge. One way that you can keep up with what's happening is to go to our website, which I'll give you in just a minute. We have a regular newsletter that we send out electronically, which includes a weekly news summary. We also have a daily news feed on our website of news from Sudan. The second thing is to let your local media know that you care about this situation, because that's the way that we'll get word to more people. The fact is that our media have a circular relationship with the public. They cover stories that they think that the public cares about, and they don't cover stories that they think people don't care about. So if you let them know that you want them to cover this, and then when they do cover it, thank them and encourage them to continue doing it, it is a way to keep this issue in the forefront of the minds of the larger community. And that feeds into the third thing that is vitally important. It's to communicate with the government your concern, the government of the United States. Just as with the media, our government cares about what we care about. Now, the United States government in some ways has paid more attention to Darfur than one would expect. It's on their radar screens, but it's not a very high priority. And the only way that it can go from being where it is to being a higher priority is if political leaders in Congress and in the White House think that it's something that matters to the American people. I know that all of you know that in 1994, genocide began in the Central African country of Rwanda. And in 100 days, as many as 800,000 people were murdered. And the world not only did nothing, it actually withdrew a UN peacekeeping force that was on the ground. Well, there's a story, and you may have read this if you read Samantha Power's book, that during the early days of the genocide, some human rights activists from Human Rights Watch went in and talked to the president's national security advisor. And he basically said there wasn't much he could do. And they said, well, we're not getting through to you. What will it take? And he said, the only way that you can change this government's policy on Rwanda is if you make more noise. We're not hearing anything from outside Washington about this. We don't think the American public cares. The same thing is true in Darfur today. The way to change policy is to make noise. The government needs to know that the public cares about this. Otherwise, it will be swamped by other priorities that the government has. Fourth thing that is very important and something very concrete that you can do is to support relief and education efforts. There are international organizations that are providing relief in Chad. They're also providing relief in Darfur, although there's still a lot of obstacles, political obstacles, that are inhibiting their ability to do that. In fact, a year ago, there were almost no aid organizations in Darfur because the Sudanese government was basically keeping them out in large part. Even though they had put people in a condition where they couldn't live without outside assistance, they were blocking that assistance. Under international pressure, some of those obstacles have been reduced, although many still remain. But there's still a pressing need for more resources to provide relief. And that's something that we can concretely do. The final thing is to make this a community effort. And you have a community that's ready-made here on your campus. Students already across the country are taking the lead on this. There are student organizations on campuses across the country that are mobilizing their campuses on Darfur. In early February, we held a National Student Leaders Conference at the museum for Darfur. And when we started organizing it, we were thinking, wow, it'd be great if we could get 150 student leaders from up and down the East Coast. As it turned out, we had to stop taking RSVPs because we didn't have space. We had 400 student leaders from 90 schools and universities across the country. So this is something where many, many people are joining together, and the students are important because if you look back on the last 50 years, every important movement for social change, including the civil rights movement, the movement against the Vietnam War, the movement against apartheid in South Africa, had students in the lead. Students have the energy, they have the voice, they have the idealism, and when they get together, they can make a difference. But you don't have to limit yourself to the campus. There's the broader community out there. And many of you are members of churches or synagogues or mosques or other organizations. And you can make this part of their community effort as well, because all of those previous things that I said can best be accomplished when groups and communities do it together. We can turn on the light. There's one more thing I want to show you along the lines of getting your communities involved. We helped organize, the museum helped organize, glad to see you're all still here. We helped organize a broad coalition called the Save Darfur Coalition, which has over 100 national organizations in it, faith-based organizations, secular organizations, all kinds of organizations. And one thing the Save Darfur Coalition does is distribute these green wristbands, which they say on it, not on my watch, which is actually a quote from Samantha Power's book when President Bush read an article that she had written about the Rwanda genocide. He put in the margin of it, not on my watch. And so that's the slogan that's been taken up by the Save Darfur Coalition, that none of us will allow genocide to go to happen on our watch. You can get these bracelets by going to the Save Darfur website, which is www.savedarfur.org. And then the final thing that I wanted to show you, which you won't be able to see because the lights are on, but is our website is www.committeeonconscience, all one word, .org. I thank you very much for your attention, and now I think we've got time for questions. Are there any other questions? I'll start with the second one rather. It helps to tell the stories. I mean, I feel in a small way that I'm doing something constructive by telling them, and so I feel like they are a burden, as you suggest. But like all burdens, it's easier to bear if you share it, and so that's the way I'm dealing with that. As far as the Bush administration, the Bush administration has done more on Darfur than traditionally has been done in situations of this type. Secretary of State Powell took the initiative at the end of last June to go to Darfur, which was, I think, a significant step for him to do, both to associate himself personally with the issue, to call attention to it, and to help bring pressure on himself to do more. And then in September of last year, he announced his determination that what is happening in Darfur is genocide, which is really an unprecedented thing for the government to do. But by and large, the strategy has been one of working through the United Nations, of undertaking diplomacy. And I think that the gap is really in what priority is being given to this, given the level of seriousness. And I think filling that gap, that's our job. Our job. That's what we can do. Is the administration has done what it has out of goodwill and a sense of concern, but I think that extra oomph is this politically important or not? Does the public care about it? And that's why I think it's so important that the public let their views be known.
This, of course, reminds me of all the other historical genocides, and my experience and my history, reading of history, is that people don't get involved unless there's an economic reason to do so. And that's often why people don't intervene in genocides, because the people who are being killed are not economically important to the outside world. So I'm curious if you see is there an economic connection here, or is this going to be marginalized like the rest of the genocides? Because America does not, U.S. nor many countries in the UN have investments in this part of the world, and the issue of race. I mean, the United States is not concerned with Africa. Hasn't been around AIDS. Why are they going to care about this like they didn't about Rwanda?
Well, did everyone hear that? The question is, if there's not an economic interest, will anyone care? And also given the racial aspect, because it's Africa, will anyone care? I think partly you've stated a truism that countries, governments, generally only act where they've got a hard interest involved. Now, I think in Sudan you can articulate a hard interest. It's not so much economic as security, that our experience over the last 10 years in particular has been that places where governments have loose control over their territory, where they engage in mass violence against their own citizens, cause a lot of other bad things to happen. Saddam Hussein launched an attack against his Kurdish population. Not only did the United States not do anything, it was actually giving him agricultural credits of $1 billion a year while he was doing it. That came back to haunt us because he was encouraged by that. In Sudan itself, in the early 90s, Osama bin Laden lived there. And he's got long-time connections with the regime there. So allowing this kind of violence to go unchecked often leads to something worse. But I think I want to challenge your premise that the idea that countries, including our country, will only respond when there are hard interests involved. Because I think that assumes that that's an unyielding law of nations and of society. And I think that that's the challenge that faces us as citizens, is whether that's what our nation stands for or not. Whether we as individuals and as groups can be moved to respond to a situation because it's only human beings that are at stake and only their lives. And I think that that's the difference that we can make is to say that no, human beings are enough. There doesn't have to be oil. There don't have to be diamonds. That the fact that you've got a population numbering in the millions at risk is enough for us to do something to stop it. Yes, ma'am. Oh, who's in charge?
I'm in charge.
Okay. Just as long as that's clear.
You just get to fill us in.
3 questions. 2 about...
3.
Well, you can choose.
She's in charge.
Okay. 2 about Sudan and 1 about Chad. What are the natural resources in the Sudan? How is this being reported in Sudan? And the third is, how is this devastating event, how is the government of Chad responding?
The questions were, what are the natural resources in Sudan? Do they play a role in this? Secondly, how is this being covered inside Sudan, in the media in Sudan? And the third is, how is Chad responding? The government of Chad, politically, how is it responding? With regard to the economics of Sudan, there's not really, well, there are resource issues actually that underlie the conflict in Darfur. They're not historic world resources. They're the fact that the groups that live there have 2 basic lifestyles. There are people who farm and people who are herders, who are somewhat nomadic and who move north to south and back and forth with their herds. And that often is reflected in this Arab-African split that I was talking about. The Africans tend to be more sedentary, the Arabs more nomadic. And one underlying tension that's made this violence possible, especially for the militias that are allied with the government, is that over time the desert is moving further south the Sahara Desert at a remarkable rate. It's like 6 kilometers per year, which you figure over 10 years, you're talking 45 miles or whatever. That was land that was arable that's now just desert. I mean real desert. To us it all looks like desert, but totally arid desert. And the result is that there's just less land, and so that's created tensions among the groups, and so that's what the government's been able to exploit. A good government resolves conflicts between groups. Every society has conflicts between groups. Ours certainly does. But you expect government to manage and resolve those conflicts instead of fuel them, which is what the Sudanese government does. In terms of Sudan as a whole, it is not rich in resources, but it could be a much more prosperous country than it is. It has oil now, which has been relatively recently developed, although most of the oil is farther to the east from Darfur. Although the oil fields do extend into southern Sudan and helped fuel conflict there, which hopefully has been resolved. It's got some timber. It has agriculture. It has often, even though it's often associated with starving people, it's been a net food exporter. It exports food to Saudi Arabia, for example. So under good government that respected the rights of its citizens, it could be, a comfortable enough country. The second question was the media in Sudan. The media in Sudan is controlled by the government. It's a military dictatorship, basically a police state, so there's not a lot of free press. There's a marginal independent press that's shut down every once in a while, but by and large, the media is favorable to the government. And so they reflect the government line, which is basically this situation is grossly overblown, primarily because the United States wants to attack another Arab country, or because the Israelis and the Jews are in a conspiracy. That's often something that they trot out. That to the extent there's violence, it's tribal violence. It's not a campaign against a particular groups. So that's reflected in their local media. And the final question was Chad. I'll just answer that very quickly. Chad has welcomed the refugees in, but it's, as you can imagine, it's a very poor country. They don't really have the resources to deal with it, so it started creating tensions. It's also been somewhat destabilizing on Chadian politics for reasons you can at least imagine.
Gerald?
Say the U.S. gets involved, then what? It's the next step is war, or what do we do? Okay.
Well, I think that when you say the U.S. gets involved, I don't think it's really in the cards that the United States is going to intervene directly with its military. I think it's a question of using all of its diplomatic and financial muscle to get an expanded African Union force on the ground. Right now, as I said, there's this little African Union monitoring force which numbers about 2,000 spread out over this area that's a little bit bigger than California. And they don't have a mandate to protect civilians. Their mandate is really to go to places where there have been attacks and then write reports. But one of the stories that this guy Brian Steidel tells, which is really remarkable, is that there came a time while he was there where the government was moving along a road and they were destroying every village that they came to. And in fact, the commander of the Sudanese military forces said, well, I have orders to clear this road, and that's what I'm doing. And there was a village called Muhajiria, which was the next village in line. And the African Union, which did not have a mandate to protect civilians, set up a very small force. I don't remember what it was, something like 35 of their protection force, which are lightly armed people, and then some of their unarmed monitors. So say 40 or 45 people in front of the village. Now they did that because there was a civilian contractor, international civilian contractor in the village. So they weren't protecting the civilians, they were protecting the contractor. And the government didn't attack. And in fact, then they set up in the village that had just been destroyed, and people started returning to that village. And then eventually the government forces and the militia went away. So that leads one to believe that if there was a bigger force that could cover more of the country and that had a mandate to protect civilians, that it would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the situation. And so that's, I think, what is the solution.
What would it take for it to change from genocide, per se, to
From genocide to civil war. Well, that's an interesting question, because sometimes the idea that genocide and civil war are mutually exclusive can be a little misleading. You can have both. I mean, there's definitely a quote-unquote civil war in Darfur because there are rebels, and there's the government and its allies, and so there is this military conflict. But on top of that conflict, or alongside it, or as part of it, is also this campaign against the civilian population, and that's what I contend is genocide. So the civil war is there for sure, but really the people who are bearing the brunt of the violence are the civilians, and they're the intended targets of the violence on the part of the government. And so civil war and genocide are existing side by side.
Deanna? Oh, okay.
There were people that wanted to support and help by donating. What might you suggest, what organization? World Vision, Doctors Without Borders, or any others?
Well, I can tell you some of the ones that are working. We don't endorse particular organizations. Both of the ones that you mentioned are working in Chad and Darfur. Catholic Relief Services are working on both sides of the border. They were very helpful to me in helping arrange the logistics of my trip. International Rescue Committee is working in both places. American Jewish World Service is working with partners. So any of those. There is an umbrella group of humanitarian organizations that is called Interaction. And I think their website is interaction.org. But you can go there to the Interaction website, and they will have a complete list of organizations that are working in Chad and or Darfur.
Excuse me, Jerry. One of the things we'll do is post some of these links up on the series webpage. We'll let you know about it through your sections. So we'll put down some of the websites that Jerry has given us, and also some places where you can make contributions. Yeah?
I don't know if this is appropriate, but I just wanted to know, how can you said that our government really wants to help, but how can that be when I'm constantly seeing images that this is bad, or that, the people that you showed is bad, or, because even through our media, through our consolidated opinions, I call it, that we see on TV, it's portrayed that it's bad. So why, would people really want to, feel that it's really important to speak up? How do we get those numbers?
You need to define more clearly what you mean by being bad.
Well, there's 2/3 of our prison population are African American. When it's shown that crime is committed equally among all races. When you see TV shows, you see the person of darker skin often portrayed as the bad guy. So with those stereotypes, how do we get those numbers? Yeah, a lot of people can't see that we all are human. We all came from one common ancestor. So how do we, get past that stereotype?
Well, I think that that's a very important question, and goes somewhat to the question that Elaine asked earlier, that it's part of the challenge that we face of creating a sense of empathy with others rather than an emphasis on difference. And I think it's absolutely true that in our country we still have a lot of challenges in that regard. And I think that in some ways meeting those challenges, a constructive step in the direction of meeting those challenges is to deal with a situation like Darfur, where you can reach people with a message of empathy and of connection, and that the children in Darfur laugh just like our children, and they cry just like our children, and they hurt just like our children. And I think that this all reinforces the message that focusing on differences and disparaging differences hurts our society. It doesn't help it.
We have the neocons gloating about the demise of the UN. And, if any of you have seen Hotel Rwanda, the UN force in Rwanda was too small to stop the killing. Is there any chance at all of having a large enough rapid deployment force with the U.S. not playing the major role but participating, and to move into these areas and stop the killing? I'm talking about a force of 100,000 that could be deployed quickly. Or is the opposition too strong within our government? And then I have another question too, if you want to try that one.
You mean having a standing rapid reaction deployment force?
Standing rapid deployment force.
Yeah. That's, a proposal that's been on the table for a long time. And actually, there are provisions that refer to the creation at least of the command structure of such a force in the United Nations Charter itself. My sense would be that the political obstacles, not just from the United States, but including from the United States, to actually creating such a force are still pretty high. And so that it's probably pretty far down the road before there's going to be any kind of standing force. I think what's much more likely, and some halting steps have been made in this direction, is the creation of a standing command structure that could coordinate troops that are contributed by member countries of the United Nations, so that you don't have to create the command structure from scratch, which is generally what's happening today. And I think that there are also some steps halting to increasing the capacity of more countries, including countries in Africa, to really effectively contribute to peacekeeping or peace enforcement missions. One problem that they had in Rwanda, and that is constantly a problem, is that countries will contribute troops, but when they show up, they're not very well equipped, they're not very well trained, so they're not very effective. That's another thing that I think that there's some will to overcome that problem, but there's still a long way to go.
David, we'll get a letter where we come back. David, I recall from Myrna's introductory remarks that you did testify in front of Congress on this very subject. This was a phenomenal presentation of these. It was compelling beyond words, and it took me quite a while to develop my composure to raise my hand. So I really thank you for what you've done here. What sort of reaction did members of Congress have when you brought this matter to their attention?
Well, I should clarify that.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, David referred to Myrna's noting that I had testified before Congress on Sudan, and asked what was the response of members of Congress when I presented this. And I should clarify that actually the time that I testified before about Sudan was actually several years ago, talking about southern Sudan. So I haven't made this presentation to Congress per se, although I've talked to a number of congressmen, and there are some people who are very, very motivated on this issue on Capitol Hill. Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas, Senator John Corzine from New Jersey, Representative Payne from New Jersey, Representative Payne Wolf from Florida, very bipartisan. All of those people have spoken at the Holocaust Museum, actually, about this issue. There are a number of others. So that's one thing that gives me hope, is that there's a core on Congress that keep coming back to this issue. They lost some steam over the holidays with the election just because they leave Washington and they're not doing things, but they're coming back together. I mean, they're starting to get focused on this now that Congress is back in session. One thing that I should say, though, is that right now, this week and next week, Congress is having what used to be called recess, but is now called district work period. And what that means is that your representatives are back here, and this is the best time to reach them. Both for all of you who are from this area, your representatives from here. For those of you who came from elsewhere, your representatives from home. because that's part and parcel of this issue of making noise. And in spite of the fact that there are some dedicated people in Congress, just the whole urgency of this situation is going to be affected by how much they feel that it really matters to the American public. And now this week and next week are particularly good times to call the district headquarters. The best thing is to find out, your representatives are going to have town hall meetings, or be out in the community. Go find a place where they're going to be, and raise this issue with them.
Can I get the student first?
Absolutely, they always come first. Earlier you mentioned, please correct me if I'm wrong, but earlier you mentioned that students were able to go to Washington to the Holocaust museum. But as a social student, I'm more interested in being in Sudan and finding out like what I can do there. So like, are there any kind of programs for that we can be involved in? You know, like maybe going there, listening to their stories, also, and providing, you know, insight about what it's like to be in America or whatever, and also by giving them clothes and food. Not clothes, not coats, and when it's extremely hot over there, or you know, but things that they can benefit from, because that's what I'm more interested in.
The question is, are there opportunities for students to go to Sudan or to Chad to work in relief efforts with the refugees or with the displaced people? My sense is there are relatively few opportunities to do that, but a good place to explore them would be on the Interaction website, and then find those organizations that are working and see if there are opportunities. There are relatively few international humanitarian workers, period, who are there. In part, it's just a very, very harsh environment. And when I was there, almost every Westerner that I met had either been sick or was sick or got sick after I left. I mean, it's very harsh. It's very remote, so it's difficult for people to get there and be sustained. So I think in some places it might not be that difficult for people to go for short periods and do stuff and then leave. In both Chad and Darfur, that's not as easy. Darfur is particularly difficult now because the security situation is very bad. In fact, in western Darfur has 3 states, north, south, and west. And in western Darfur, at least as of a few days ago, I don't know if it's changed, basically all the UN and other workers were locked down in the capital city because it was too dangerous. The Janjaweed had started saying, you know, we're going to be attacking international workers. And so the security situation is so tense that they're just in their compounds. They're not actually helping people. And that follows on a continually tense situation. Also, the Sudanese government doesn't allow everyone to go in who wants to go in. In fact, I've applied for a visa, and for reasons I can't imagine, they won't give it to me. But they actually, I was speaking one time in Washington, and this representative of the Sudanese government was there, and he stood up, and he said, well, you've been to Chad, you haven't been to Darfur. And I said, well, I'll go to Darfur. And he goes, well, you haven't applied for a visa. And I said, well, it never occurred to me that you would give me one. Will you give me a visa? And there was a group, there was like 100 people there. And he goes, well, you haven't applied for one. And I said, well, I'm telling you right now, I'm going to apply. I'm going to go back to my office and apply. Will you give me a visa? And he goes, well, you apply and see what happens. I think you might be surprised. So I did apply, and I haven't been surprised. But
we're going to get to those questions. I want to point out to the students that we'll be handing out the final exam at the midterm. We'll be handing out the midterm at the end of the lecture today. So if you're thinking of bolting around,
Also, students in my section see me, I have some material to return to you.
Okay, Joel. I've noticed a lot of genocide occurring when the world knows about it. When you mentioned Rwanda, I would include Biafra in that. And during a time when people were wearing wristbands, and they go on anyway. And yet, if the Western powers want to act, for example, if the French government would send troops into Chad with the mandate for protecting civilians in Darfur. It seems to me that that could be done. That would take a very small force, nowhere near the 100,000 that we're talking about, at least to ensure that no helicopters bombed villages. Why is no one suggesting that? Why is no one suggesting no-fly zones in Darfur?
The question started out very broad and then got very specific, which is good style. The broad issue is that genocide and mass violence has happened in the past. People have known about it and not done anything. And in this particular case, it would be relatively easy for the French in particular, who already have a garrison in Chad, to provide a force to protect civilians in Darfur, or at least to enforce a no-fly zone. And part of the question was, why hasn't anyone proposed that? Well, actually, there have been. No-fly zone is something that a lot of people are pushing that does appear to be very feasible, could be accomplished with NATO assets. I mean, it would take NATO. The Africans don't really have the air assets to do it, but it could be done. It's something that people are pushing for. I think your point, which is very important, is that there's not yet the will to do it. And the tenor of your question is kind of, well, is this just the same old story that we've seen over and over again, and will it always be the same old story? And which is a question that a lot of people raise.
I guess my point is that in my experience, if a genocide has been stopped, it has been stopped by force, and that most of the student movements that you have spoken about that brought about change, I'd say especially at the universities, I guess don't get behind that and don't believe that and don't push for that.
Oh, I see. You're focusing on the need for force. Well, I think that it may be that there might be some need for force, although a no-fly zone would not be force. I mean, it would be the threat of force. You fly your helicopters, we're going to shoot them down. But the Sudanese aren't going to fly their helicopters if there's a no-fly zone. So the threat would be enough. This idea of an expanded and empowered African Union force would be force, but I think there would be wide support among students for that. I mean, most of the students that I know. So I'm not sure I quite accept the premise of the question. I do think that it is true that only cajoling the Sudanese government is probably not going to be enough. It's certainly not going to be enough. That it is going to require putting people on the ground in Darfur who are armed, who can interpose themselves between the bad guys and the civilians. But my sense is that the students aren't the thing that are keeping that from happening. It's the governments.
Okay, we have time for Barbara's last question.
One of the things I've noticed is the increasing power of the internet to rally support for putting pressure on the government on particular issues. Groups like People for the American Way or MoveOn.org, who've really helped us by sending us directly to our emails, the draft letter, the people to contact. Has there been any attempt to try to get those groups to take on this issue so that we're able to use some of those huge networks that have already been established?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of those networks have gotten involved. MoveOn's done some, although they haven't made it a priority. Yeah. Some larger groups, such as True Majority, which was set up by Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's. Religious groups, including religious conservatives, who have a very powerful network. So, those are being brought to bear. That's. I was saying to Elaine at the beginning, and I think, well, if you have a question, I'll take it. But so I won't conclude with this. But I think it's very important. I think we're getting close to a critical mass on this. Things were building in the fall, and then the holidays came along, and then the tsunami, which distracted a lot of attention, obviously. And then in January, a peace agreement was signed to resolve the conflict in the south. And so a lot of people saw the headline, peace agreement in Sudan. And so those three things really just took the wind out of our sails. And I think we're starting to build back up, and there's just still an incredible amount of interest. There are people all across the country, you know, who are working on this, who are doing things, and including students. And I just feel we're getting close to a critical mass. And the fact is that the situation is getting worse. So it's not, people can't point to progress that's been made. And so, yeah, I think we're so close.
Perhaps if you,
I think,
a question?
Yeah.
Walter.
Which country has the leadership in the Union, African Union? Is it the Union of South Africa?
Which country has the leadership in the Union of African Union?
The African Union, of course, comprises all of the countries in Africa. The most influential are South Africa is one of them, Nigeria. Those are the two most important, Nigeria and South Africa. Kenya is also very influential. One thing that's been a little difficult for the African Union is that it includes the countries in North Africa, which are Arab countries, and this emphasis on Arab-African nature of the conflict tends to cause the same fracture to exist in the African Union. So, that's created some diplomatic difficulties. But those are the countries that are the most influential in the African Union.
They in turn have the Arab element.
In some of those cases, yeah, in some they do. Yeah. Thank you.
One very brief announcement before we thank Jerry, and that is there's a human rights club on this campus. I'm the advisor. Anybody who wants to come to me and propose that we work together to start working and have students to do something, be it collecting money or buying wristbands or whatever, you come and see me and we'll figure out some way to do some work. Students in this class were very instrumental last year and the year before in collecting money for orphans in Rwanda, and we made a small but important contribution. So, Human Rights Club, come and see me and we'll start organizing. Don't forget that your midterm exams are due on April the 4th in this room. 5th. Okay, Barbara says April 5th. And the Yom HaShoah is on May